Today we're discussing Chapter 23, covering the respiratory system. So there are two systems that are going to cooperate to supply oxygen and eliminate carbon dioxide to the body. And those are the cardiovascular system, which we've already discussed, and the respiratory system. The respiratory system is going to provide for gas exchange, while the cardiovascular system is responsible for transporting those respiratory gases. So failure of either system is going to have about the same effect on the body. It's going to cause disruption of homeostasis, and it's also going to cause rapid cell death from oxygen starvation and a buildup of those waste products in the tissues. So both of them are very important. They function very nicely together. So there are three main functions for the respiratory system. The first is that the respiratory system is going to provide for gas exchange, and this means the intake of oxygen is done for delivery to the body's cells, and the removal of CO2 is produced that's produced by the body's cells. Secondly, the respiratory system is going to help to regulate the pH of the body's blood. And the third thing that the respiratory system does is it's going to contain receptors for senses of smell. It's also going to filter inspired air. It's also going to produce vocal sounds, phonations, as well as excreting small amounts of water and heat. So there are three main steps that are going to be involved in respiration. Right? So the process of supplying the body with oxygen and removing that CO2 is what we call respiration. And there are three basic steps that are followed for this process to happen. The first step is pulmonary ventilation. This is also known as breathing to the rest of the world. And this is going to be the inhalation or inflow and the exhalation or outflow of air, and it's going to involve the exchange of air between the atmosphere and the alveoli of the lungs. So inhalation is going to permit or allow oxygen to enter the lungs, and exhalation is going to allow CO2 to leave the lungs. The second step is external respiration or pulmonary respiration. This is going to involve the exchanges of gases between the alveoli of the lungs and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries across that respiratory membrane. So in this process, pulmonary capillary blood is going to gain it's going to gain oxygen and lose CO2. And then our third and final step is internal respiration or tissue respiration. And this is going to be the exchange of gases between the blood and systemic capillaries and tissues, or in the tissue cells. So in this step, the blood is going to lose its oxygen and gain its CO2. So within the cells, the metabolic reactions that are going to consume oxygen and give off CO2 during the production of ATP are going to be termed as cellular respiration. There are several components to the respiratory system, all right? We divide that into a couple of different parts as well, all right? So structurally, we divide the respiratory system into the components into two parts. We've got our upper respiratory system and our lower respiratory system. Our upper respiratory system is going to be made up of the nose, the pharynx, and the associated structures that go with them. And then the lower respiratory system is going to include the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the lungs. However, we can also kind of divide the components of the respiratory system up based on functionality. And the components of the respiratory system are going to be divided into two main zones: the conducting zone and the respiratory zone. So in the conducting zone, we're going to have a series of cavities and tubes, things like the nose, the pharynx, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, as well as the terminal bronchioles that are going to conduct air into the lungs. The second zone is the respiratory zone, and this is going to be the area where gas exchange is going to actually occur. This is going to be our respiratory bronchioles, as well as our alveolar ducts, our alveolar sacs, and the alveoli themselves. So here you can see just an image. This is looking at how we break down our respiratory tracts. We're talking about the upper versus the lower respiratory tract. So we're going to start by discussing the upper respiratory tracts. So the first main part of the upper respiratory system is the external nose. And you might be surprised that there's more to the nose than meets the eye, as far as anatomically speaking. But overall, it's not terribly complicated. So the nose is going to be a specialized organ that's going to consist of a visible external portion, like the actual part of your nose that you can see on your face. And that's the external part of the nose. And then the internal portion inside the skull. And this is called the nasal cavity. And this is also known as the internal nose. So the external nose is going to be the portion of the nose that's visible on the face, and it's going to consist of a supporting framework of bone and hyaline cartilage. And this is covered with muscle and skin, and it's going to be lined on the inside by a mucous membrane. The frontal bone, the nasal bone, and the maxilla are going to form the bony framework of the nose, and you can actually see that up here. But the vast majority of your nose that you can actually see on your face, a large portion of it is actually going to be made up of cartilage. And this is going to be the cartilaginous framework, and this is part of the external nose. It's going to consist of several pieces of hyaline cartilage that are connected to each other and they're going to also be connected to certain skull bones by fibrous connective tissue. So the components of the cartilaginous framework are going to be the septal nasal cartilage, and this is going to form the anterior portion of the nasal septum. We then have the lateral nasal cartilage. This is going to be inferior to the nasal bones. And then the alar cartilage, and this is going to form a portion of the walls of the nostrils themselves. So some people, I guess, could possibly get some of this part pierced. Although I guess you could get some of your septal cartilage and your lateral cartilage pierced too. I don't know. People poke all kind of holes in their body. But anyhow, so you could in theory pierce some of these things. So on the undersurface of the external nose are going to be two openings called the external nares, also called the nostrils to normal people. And these are going to lead into cavities that are called the nasal vestibules. So when you're see your kid or you or whoever picking their nose, they actually have their finger in their nasal vestibules. So try telling your toddler that next time they pick their nose. See how that goes. So next we have the internal nose. All right, this is going to be the interior structure of the nose, and this is specialized for warming, moistening, and filtering the incoming air. It's also going to be involved in receiving olfactory stimuli, as well as serving as a large, hollow, resonating chamber to modify speech sounds. So this is why, this region right here is why when you have a stuffy nose, like a bad cold, your voice is going to sound a little bit funny because that resonating chamber is a little bit less hollow, and so things are not going to resonate as well, and you're going to sound stuffy. So then anteriorly, the nasal cavity is going to merge with the external nose, and posteriorly, it's going to communicate with the pharynx through two openings called the internal nares or the concha. Right? So the ducts from the paranasal sinuses, which are going to drain mucus, super gross, I know, are, as well as the nasolacrimal ducts, which are going to also drain tears, are going to open into the nasal cavity. So the inside of both the external and internal nose are going to be called the nasal cavity. And this is going to be divided into a right and a left side by the nasal septum. So the anterior portion of this cavity is called the vestibule, which again, where you're sticking your fingers when you're picking your nose. So good times. The next part of the internal nose is the bony and cartilaginous framework. And this is going to help to keep the vestibules and the nasal cavity patent. That just basically means it's going to keep it open or unobstructed. So the nasal cavity is divided into a larger inferior respiratory region and a smaller superior olfactory region. The respiratory region is going to be lined with ciliated, pseudostratified columnar epithelium that are going to have numerous little goblet cells on them, and these are going to frequently be called respiratory epithelium. The anterior portion of the nasal cavity that's just behind the nostrils is called the nasal vestibule. And this is going to be surrounded by cartilage. And the superior part of the nasal cavity is going to be surrounded by bone. So, moving forward with the internal nose then. So when air enters the nostrils, it's going to pass first through the vestibules, which are going to be lined by skin that are going to contain coarse hairs that are going to help to filter out any kind of dust particles, help to filter that out a little bit. Then there are going to be 3 shelves that are going to be formed by projections of the superior, middle, and inferior nasal concha. And these are going to extend out of the lateral wall of the nasal cavity. Those concha are almost going to reach the nasal septum, and then they're going to subdivide each side of the nasal cavity into a series of sort of groove-like pathways. And you can see those here, these crazy sort of bits, these groove-like pathways. And the mucous membrane is going to line the nasal cavity and as well as its shelves. So the arrangement of the concha and the meatuses are going to increase surface area in the internal nose, and this is going to help to prevent dehydration by trapping water droplets during exhalation. So here we can look at the surface anatomy of the nose with our very 90s kind of picture we've got going on here. So here we can see the root of the nose, right? The apex of the nose is like the pointy part where you would boop somebody on the nose. That is the apex of the nose. The bridge of the nose is where your glasses would sit if you wore sunglasses or regular reading glasses. And then the external nares are going to be your nostrils. So here you can see, so those are all the various parts of the surface anatomy of the nose. Not too complicated. Moving forward then to the pharynx. The pharynx is going to function as a pathway for air and food, and it's also going to provide a resonating chamber for speech sounds, and is going to house the tonsils. The tonsils, interestingly enough, are going to participate in immunological reactions against foreign invaders, although, as some of you may know, they are not always necessary. You can have them removed and still go about life as normal. The pharynx, also called the throat, is going to be a muscular tube that's lined by a mucous membrane. And the anatomic regions of the pharynx are going to be the nasopharynx, which you can see here, the oropharynx, which is going to be the first bit of the throat, and then the laryngeal pharynx here. So the nasal pharynx is going to be involved in respiration only. Okay, that's important. So only respiration for the nasopharynx. But both the oropharynx and the laryngeal pharynx are going to function in both digestion and in respiration. That means they're going to serve as a passageway for both air and food. So, moving forward now to discuss the parts of the lower respiratory system. First up, we have the larynx. This is also commonly called the voice box, and this is going to be a passageway that's going to connect the pharynx with the trachea. So it's going to contain a couple of different things. It's going to have the thyroid cartilage, also known as the Adam's apple, which is very large and distinct in men. It's going to have the epiglottis. This is going to be a covering that's going to prevent food from entering the larynx. The cricoid cartilage is going to connect the larynx and the trachea, and then there's going to be a paired arytenoid, corniculate, and cuneiform cartilages. So, the wall of the larynx is going to be composed of 9 pieces of cartilage. So 3 of these are going to occur singly. There's the thyroid cartilage, the epiglottis, and the cricoid cartilage. And then there are going to be 3 that are going to occur in pairs. And these are the arytenoid, the cuneiform, and the corniculated cartilages. So of the pairs of cartilages, the arytenoid cartilages are going to be the most important. And this is because they are going to influence changes in the position and the tension of the vocal cords. These are also called the true vocal cords for speech. So the extrinsic muscles of the larynx are going to connect the cartilages to other structures in the throat, and the intrinsic muscles are going to connect the cartilages to one another. And the intrinsic muscles are going to connect cartilages to one another. The cavity from the larynx is going to be the space that is going to extend from the entrance into the larynx and then down into the inferior border of the cricoid cartilage. So the portion of the cavity of the larynx is above the vestibular folds. These are called false vocal cords. Are also called laryngeal vestibules. And the portion of the cavity of the larynx that's below the vocal cords is called the infraglottic cavity. So the first part of the larynx that we're going to discuss is the thyroid cartilage. This is also called the Adam's apple, and this consists of two fused plates of hyaline cartilage that are going to form the anterior wall of the larynx. And this is going to give the larynx a sort of triangular shape. So this is present in both male and females. However, it's usually much larger in males, and this is due to the influence of male sex hormones like testosterone during puberty. The ligament that connects the thyroid cartilage to the hyoid bone is called the thyrohyaloid membrane, and the lining of the larynx, it's superior to the vocal folds, is non-keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. The lining of the larynx that's inferior to the vocal folds is going to be ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, and this is going to consist of ciliated columnar cells as well as some goblet and basal cells. The mucus that's produced by these goblet cells is going to be responsible for helping to trap dust that's not been removed in the upper passages. And then the cilia that are in the upper respiratory tract are going to move mucus and trapped particles downward towards the pharynx. And then the cilia that are in the lower respiratory tract are going to move them upward towards the pharynx. Next, we have the epiglottis. This is going to be a large kind of leaf-shaped piece of elastic cartilage, and this is going to covered with epithelium. So the stem of the leaf, like the stem of the epiglottis, you can see that here, is going to be the tapered inferior portion that is going to be attached to the anterior rim of the thyroid cartilage. And then the broad superior leaf kind of portion, the main body of it here, of the epiglottis, this is going to be unattached and is going to be able to freely move up and down, kind of like a trapdoor. So during swallowing, the pharynx and the larynx are going to rise, and the elevation of the pharynx is going to widen. That way it is able to receive food and drink. Elevation of the larynx is also going to cause the epiglottis to move down and form a lid over the glottis, so it's closing off to keep food and drink stuffs out of the airway. So the glottis itself is going to consist of a pair of folds of mucous membrane, and these are the vocal folds, also called the true vocal cords. These are found in the larynx, and then there's the space that's between them is called the rima glottis. The closing of the larynx in this way during swallowing is going to help to route liquid and food into the esophagus, and it helps to keep them out of the larynx and the airways. So when, however, small particles of dust or smoke, food, or liquids pass into the larynx by accident, then a cough reflex is going to occur in an attempt to expel that material. So now let's look at the structures that are going to be involved in voice production. So for starters, the mucous membrane of the larynx is going to form two pairs of folds. There's a superior pair of folds called the vestibular folds. These are also known as the false vocal cords. And then there's an inferior pair that are called the vocal cords, also called the true vocal cords. The space between the vestibular folds is known as the rima vestibuli, and the laryngeal ventricles is going to be a lateral expansion of the middle portion of the laryngeal cavity. And this is inferior to the vestibular folds and superior to the vocal folds. So it's in between the two folds there. While the vestibular folds do not function in actual voice production, they are going to be very important. They're going to have a very important functional role in voice sounds. So when the vestibular folds are brought together, they're going to function in holding the breath against pressure in the thoracic cavity, like you might do for a person who's straining to lift like a heavy weight. So the vocal folds are going to be the principal structures in voice production. The deep to the mucous membrane of the vocal folds are going to be bands of elastic ligaments that are going to be stretched between the rigid cartilages of the larynx. The intrinsic laryngeal muscles are going to attach to both the rigid cartilages and the vocal folds. And then when the muscles contract, they're going to move those cartilages. This is in turn going to pull on the elastic ligaments, going to pull them tight. And this is going to stretch those vocal folds out into the airway so that the rima glottis is going to be narrowed. Then contracting and relaxing those muscles is going to vary the tension in the vocal folds, kind of like what you would do if you were tightening or loosening a guitar string. So air is going to pass through the larynx, and it's going to cause it to vibrate, cause those folds to vibrate, and this is going to produce sounds, also called phonation. Right? So by setting up sound waves in the column of the air in the pharynx, the nose, and the mouth, this is how we make phonation, or sounds. The variation in the pitch of the sound is going to be related to the tension that's in the vocal folds. So the greater the pressure of air, the louder the sound that's produced by the vibrating vocal cords. So looking real quick at the structures of voice production, when the intrinsic muscles of the larynx contract, they're going to pull on the arytenoid cartilages, and these are going to cause those cartilages to kind of pivot and slide. Then the contraction of the posterior cricoarytenoid muscles, this is, for example, going to move those vocal folds apart. It's going to cause abduction to occur, and this is thereby going to open the rima glottis. In contrast, though, on the other hand, if we contract the lateral cricoarytenoid muscles, this is going to move those vocal folds together, i.e. adduction, and this is thereby going to close the rima glottis. Other intrinsic muscles also can elongate and place tension on the vocal folds, or they can shorten and relax the vocal cords or the vocal folds. So pitch is going to be controlled by the tension of the vocal cords. If they're pulled taut by the muscles, then they're going to vibrate more rapidly, and a higher pitch is going to be produced. So the resulting, when we decrease the muscular tension on the vocal folds, this is going to cause them to vibrate more slowly and produce a lower pitch. This is due to the influence of androgen in So when we look at men, right, who typically have a lower pitched voice, this is due to the influence of androgens on the vocal folds, and these are usually going to be thicker and longer in males than they are in females, and therefore are going to vibrate more slowly, resulting in a lower range in pitch than what a woman would typically have. So sounds are going to originate from the vibration of the vocal folds, but other structures are going to be necessary for converting the sound into recognizable speech. The pharynx, the mouth, the nasal cavity, and the paranasal sinuses are all going to act as resonating chambers, and these are going to give the voice its human and sort of individual quality. So we produce the vowel sounds by constricting and relaxing the muscles in the walls of the pharynx, and the muscles of the face, tongue, and lips are going to help us to enunciate words. Next, we have the trachea. This is also called the windpipe, and this is anterior to the esophagus. This is going to extend from the larynx to the primary bronchi of the lungs, and the layers of the tracheal wall, from deep to superficial, are going to be the mucosa, the submucosa, the hyaline cartilage, and the adventitia, which is composed of areolar connective tissue. The mucosa of the trachea is going to consist of an epithelial layer of ciliated pseudostratified columnar epithelium, as well as an underlying layer of lamina propria that's going to contain elastic and reticular fibers. This is also going to provide the same protection against dust as the membrane lining that's found in the nasal cavity and in the larynx. The mucosa then is going to consist of areolar connective tissue that contains seromucosal glands as well as their ducts. And the trachea is going to be the 16 to 20, going to have 16 to 20 incomplete horizontal rings of hyaline cartilage. And these are going to resemble the letter C. You can kind of see them here. And you can actually kind of feel them when you feel like your trachea through your neck there. These are going to be stacked one above another and are going to be connected by dense connective tissue. The open part of each C-shaped cartilage ring is going to face posteriorly towards the esophagus, and this is going to be spanned by a fibromuscular membrane. Then within the trachea is this membrane. Within those membranes are going to be transverse smooth muscle fibers, and these are called trachealis muscles, as well as some elastic connective tissue. So this trachealis muscle is going to allow the diameter of the trachea to change subtly during inhalation and exhalation, and this is going to be really important in maintaining efficient airflow. So the solid C-shaped ring cartilage is going to provide a semi-rigid support to maintain patency, so that the trachea walls don't collapse inward, especially like during inhalation. They don't fall in on themselves. They maintain their open structure, and this is going to allow for an unobstructed air pathway. The adventitia of the trachea is going to consist of areolar connective tissue, and these are going to join the trachea to the surrounding tissues. So that is all that we have for the first part of our lecture on the respiratory system. As always, if there are any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to contact me or ask after class. So I'll see you next time.